Trial by Viking is a two-dimensional action platformer developed by Last Life Games. The story revolves around Norse mythology and has the player take on the role of a Viking. Odin has called upon you to assist in the recovery of an artifact known as the Sunstone, which was shattered by Loki. The game is separated into levels, 130 in total, each housing several shards of the Sunstone. These areas are typically littered with a number of enemies and puzzles. While the only required goal of each level is to reach the end, collecting gems will allow the player to exchange them for items from Odin. The shop can be accessed before starting up a new level. It houses upgrades for your primary weapon as well as sub-weapons and accessories. New axes are straight up damage upgrades, but halfway down the path each unique axe will grant a specific boon. For example, the first of these axes grants an additional 3% chance to crit, while the next gives a 50% chance to freeze enemies. A more interesting system could have been put in place here, allowing the player to infuse enchantments onto their weapons instead. With this, they could perhaps spend gems to upgrade a specific effect throughout the game instead of being bottlenecked into one through natural progression. As it stands, there is little reason to ever switch to a previous weapon since damage trumps all of the effects, outside of requiring freeze for a handful of puzzle scenarios. Sub-weapons vary greatly, from boomerangs to grapple hooks. These have applications in both combat and exploration. One gripe I had regarding sub-weapons involved weapon switching. To change between different sub-weapons, the player is required to enter a rather clunky menu. I can't see any reason to not just have a button available to cycle through them. The accessories typically grant passive boons to the player and are always activated once they are purchased. One example allows the player to double jump, while another enables underwater breath. Similar to sub-weapons, these items are often required for exploration. Since many items are necessary for opening up specific areas within levels, there is a bit of a Metroidvania feel with the game. Early on, you'll come across locations that you simply cannot access without bombs, for example, and will need to revisit those places later. Even further on, these items will be required to finish levels, and not just for optional areas. So that the player can't ever screw themselves over, they can at any point reset their purchases to then buy the item they need to clear a level. Within the first few levels, players gain the ability to roll, which grants invincibility and damages enemies. This roll is performed by either pressing a designated button or tapping left or right twice. Infuriatingly, there's no option to disable the ability to roll by double tapping a direction. This led to a ton of accidental rolling when attempting to adjust my position on smaller platforms, ultimately causing some deaths. Every 5th level was a boss stage. Bosses in Trial by Viking typically aren't too great. I found that most of the fights can be cheesed either by spamming your ranged axe toss and occasionally dodging away, or by instead rolling into the monster and mashing the melee attack. There were at least a few exceptions that felt like good encounters, though they were few and far between. I'd also like to point out that I played the game on the hardest available difficulty, so I had expected at least some challenge when it came to boss fights. Also, on the topic of difficulty, the hardest difficulty in the game isn't unlocked until after the game is completed. As far as I could tell, difficulty only affects damage numbers and enemy health, so there should be no reason for the Viking difficulty to not be selectable from the get-go. After each boss stage, you are given the option of upgrading a stat. These include raising your armor or giving a small chance to freeze enemies, and so on. Nothing huge, but enough to give a sense of customization. One of the greatest things in Trial by Viking is how frequently new mechanics and enemy types are thrown at the player. Because of this, the game never felt stale throughout, since things constantly felt fresh. Though with so many mechanics, you are bound to get a few bad seeds. One such bad seed was the black hole. These appear very late in the game and only in 3 levels total, but just about drove me insane. I don't know if I'm just an idiot, but I could not for the life of me figure out how these gravity wells function. Also, this mechanic is introduced in a level filled with bottomless pits, which made any attempt at experimenting very unforgivable. Other level types felt a bit like fluff. One in particular involved controlling a Valkyrie as she carries you through the skies. Only 2 levels in the game featured this, and they were each around 25 seconds in length, feeling like a bit of a waste of a level slot. Outside of these examples, I had absolutely no issues with the level design. I love how frequently red herrings were implemented, and trying to find every single sunstone shard was very enjoyable. As far as actual challenge goes, the game felt very fair, though had several sections set up to easily knock the player into bottomless pits. Most of the difficulty instead comes from trying to find all the collectibles and not from combat or trap avoidance. It's easy to see the amount of care and work that was put into Trial by Viking. For the asking price of $15 players can expect anywhere from 10 to 15 hours of gameplay, depending on how devoted they are to finding all of the gems. Trial by Viking was certainly one of the more enjoyable video games I've played as of late, and I can't wait to see more from Last Life Games.